Okay, so we're talking today about the flipping box, which is really a way of talking about changing your rigid thinking. And we're going to start with an old story. It's called Six Blind Men and the Elephant. Probably heard it. So six blind men are gathered and asked to describe an object which they don't know what it is. And the first one grabs a trunk and he says, well, it's a snake. The second one grabs a leg and declares, no, it's a tree. The third one pushes against the side of the elephant and says, completely convinced, it's a wall. Number four touches an ear, declares it's a fan. Number five touches the tail and says it's a rope. And the sixth one touches the tusk and is convinced that it's a spear. And you see a picture here, a drawing of these guys fumbling around with the elephant. So each of the blind men is absolutely convinced that his perception is correct. And so an argument breaks out and they begin fighting amongst themselves and hitting each other in the head and boxing each other's ears over this argument about what, in fact, the object that they've been touching is. And finally, exhausted, they sit down and decide to share their perceptions and come to the conclusion that, in fact, none of them were right, and that, in fact, by collecting their perceptions, they discover that, in fact, it was an elephant. So why is this a valuable story? Because to some extent, we all do what the six blind men did, which is we come to a conclusion based on our own perceptions. We then close our minds to any further information and act as if we have discovered a universal, immutable truth. And we don't want to hear anything that contradicts what we have now determined to be this, eternal truth. So this kind of rigidity in thinking and in feeling has consequences. What do people do? They tend to, when they get really rigid like this, with this, they avoid other people that contradict what they're thinking and feeling. They won't read books that contradict their thoughts, perceptions. They won't get into situations where they might hear or get evidence of something different than what they think is true. They avoid media, television or radio or even films that would cause them to maybe rethink their perception. So they go on living in this kind of silo, self-imposed silo. So what's the problem with this? Well, all over the world, we really see the unfortunate results of this kind of thinking or failure of thinking. What do we see? Unequal treatment of women all over the world, which is this kind of belief that primarily men have, is that somehow or another they are more equal than women and more deserving. It was really interesting when that Muhammad Yunus, a few years back, he won the Nobel Prize, and he did this little experiment in India. Well, not a little experiment, it's actually a pretty major experiment, where he did micro-lending. And what he discovered, you could make very, very small loans, a few dollars, literally, and the women would start businesses and do all kinds of things, and they used the profits to benefit their families. If you get the same thing with the men, they mainly sat around, smoked cigarettes, and drank, and didn't produce much of anything. But nonetheless, until he came up with that, the banks were much more willing to lend to men, because Who's running the banks? Men. People categorized by race, ethnicity, skin color, religion, of course, gender, or by their sexual orientation or by their political orientation. This list goes on and on and on in terms of the way that we develop a rigid idea and feelings around it. And then you discover, I mean, we certainly have the history of the United States is a history of racism. You know, how we have treated African Americans who we brought here as slaves, how we treated Native Americans who were, they were actually, we were the immigrants, and how we treated them, almost extinguished them by design. Then you see situations in the let's say the Middle East comes to mind, where you have people who are actually all of the same ethnicity and the same religion, but they're a different sect of the same religion, and they're killing each other over some rigidity in terms of who is actually following the true religion. Terrible, terrible, terrible consequences. So we see hate crimes, violence, war, starvation, and a lot of suffering due to this inability to get out of the I'm right, everybody else who has a different point of view is not only wrong, they're a traitor or a heretic. So we have these bad patterns, you know, which, I mean, we can give some examples. So women should never be in charge? Really? It's okay to take away the children of asylum seekers who are fleeing violence and put them in cages? How did we get that idea? And in our own situation, is treatment for sissies, okay? You know, the real men or, you know, stand-up people don't really need, they can just figure it out on their own. Some people, you know, they've been here for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and I'm cool. So staying at Amity for 12 months is crazy, even though the evidence of 50 years of research is that a better plan would be a year or at least 6 months to get the benefits of being in a teaching and therapeutic community. So all these thoughts, these rigid patterns of thoughts, and being unable to look at the other side, to take in other information, has ruinous consequences for us, both as individuals and as societies. So our brains, and here's a picture of your brain, more or less, our brains actually, the good news is, are kind of designed to accept alternatives. The hardware we have is not particularly rigid. It's the software that's the problem. So on the next slide, you're going to see something simple. You're going to see a cube. And what I want you to do is just look at it intently. We'll leave it up for about a minute. Look at it intently until something happens that may seem unusual to you. And then continue to look at it until it happens again. So here it is. Okay. For some of you, the box flipped very quickly. It kind of goes whoop, whoop. You know, the front becomes the back becomes the front, or it changes from one, you have one perception of it and then it flips. And this is a natural phenomena. You don't really have to do anything. Just look at it and it happens. For some people, it happens in just a matter of seconds and it'll start flipping back and forth. For other people, it takes longer, sometimes quite a bit longer. But for everyone, if you just stare at it, it will flip. And after a while, you'll be able to consciously flip the box back and forth without very much effort. So let's try it one more time, just to prove you can do it. So here's another cube. Take a look and make it flip. So, this very simple experiment, we now know, or you now know, it's natural to see more than one perspective. And with practice, it's easier and easier to do it. Now, flipping a box, what we call an ambiguous optical situation, is a lot easier than flipping your religious beliefs, or you're changing your opinion about immigrants, or getting over some racist ideologies that might have been planted in you as a child. But it is possible, and your brain is open to that. So it's a matter of practice, and it's you practice with small things. I thought George was stupid, and I discovered by talking to him, having a conversation with the guy's really pretty damn bright. That's a flip of the box, I didn't think Sally had any skills whatsoever, and then I went into the kitchen with her, and wow, she's a whiz. Okay, that's a flip of the box. The flipping box can occur every day in our perceptions of people, of relationships, of situations, if we allow ourselves to be open and allow it to flip. The box will kind of flip naturally. If you look at it long enough, you actually, I don't think you can control it not doing it. But we have learned as human beings to control the box flip in many senses. We've learned how to be rigid and to avoid the thing that our brain is pretty open to doing, which is accepting multiple possibilities in almost every situation. So, very simply, let's take this newfound skill, which you didn't know you had, and bring it into our lives, and avoid some of the really kind of awful consequences of our rigidity.